In this online class, I'm creating what we call in Australia a Swiss roll, can also be referred to as a Yule log. I've got chocolate sponge, which I'm going to fill with a whipped ruby chocolate ganache, scattered berries, which is rolled. I'm then going to freeze it, and then I'm going to enrobe it with the ruby chocolate with caramelized almonds, finishing it on top with some whipped ruby ganache and some fresh berries and a little chocolate decor. Before starting this recipe, you may want to watch our video on ruby chocolate and tempering. Before you start making your sponge, you need to prepare the sponge tin so you're ready to go when the mixture is ready, because it's not great for the sponge mix to sit for a long period of time before your cake tin is ready. The other thing you need to do at this stage is to preset your oven at 190 degrees Celsius before you start whisking your eggs and sugar. I'm going to use a little bit of oil spray on the surface, and I've put the dimensions of this tray in the recipe. Doesn't matter if it's a little bit different, as long as it's as close as possible to this tray size. Place a sheet of baking paper in. Press it down so it goes right into the corners. And it doesn't matter as well if the sides of your baking dish are a little bit higher. Now we're ready to start the sponge. This basic sponge recipe is fantastic, so keep it in your repertoire. We're going to just combine sugar and eggs. Now, I always recommend you weigh your eggs because they come in so many different sizes now. This is the only way to ensure that the recipe is accurate. Another tip with your eggs is to not have them straight from the fridge when you're whipping them up. So you can warm the whole eggs before you crack them in a bowl of warm water, about body temperature, 36 to 37 degrees Celsius. Or once you crack them open, you can sit the bowl in a warm water bath just to warm them up a little bit, and you'll get a much better aeration in your sponge. Now we're going to whisk this up until it's really light and fluffy. The more air we incorporate it, the paler the mixture will get, but also the lighter our sponge will be. While that's whisking up, I'm going to sieve some cocoa powder, so Callebaut Dutch processed cocoa powder, and what we call plain or all-purpose flour. We want this base mixture of our eggs and sugar to be really light and aerated, because this is how the sponge is going to rise, so that air expands in the oven. So the difference between a cake and a sponge is a cake often uses other methods of aeration like baking powder, bicarb soda, and has other ingredients in there. With a sponge, we're wholly relying on that aeration of the eggs and sugar to give us that lightness and lift. Now I've sieved the dry ingredients. We're going to gently add them and fold them in. So this is a crucial step that's important not to overwork the mixture, but it's very easy once you know how. I've sieved this onto a sheet of baking paper to make it very easy to apply it to the sponge, even if you're by yourself. So just fold the paper up, and then we slowly add in a little bit of our dry ingredients at a time. And just a tip, if you're wanting to make this as a plain vanilla sponge or a white sponge, replace the quantity of cocoa powder with flour. Just gently and lightly fold the dry ingredients through, which means we're using a spoon to go from the side to the base of the bowl and back up again. Use as little movement as possible to incorporate each application of your dry ingredients. You don't have to fully mix it in, so you can see I've still got some particles there that aren't mixed in. Now I'm going to add the second application of the dry ingredients. Use the same folding technique each time. This is a great sponge recipe because it has the flexibility to actually roll up without cracking. Now I'm going to add the last application of our dry ingredients. As soon as this is mixed through, we then stop mixing. Now the sponge is all mixed together. We're going to immediately apply it to our prepared baking tray. Now with as little movement as possible, we're going to spread the sponge mixture as evenly as we can into the prepared tray. So I'm using a palette knife, but you can also use a normal knife if you want to. With a palette knife, just angle it slightly. And you don't want to move it too much because every time you move it, you do knock out a little bit of air. How do you know if your sponge is evenly spread out? You can do a simple test with just a knife and you can stick it in to the sponge and see where it comes to. Use multiple knives just to test in certain areas to see that they're the same. So test multiple positions on the sponge, do a comparison, and I think I'm pretty good and ready to go into the oven. Now this is going to bake at 190 degrees Celsius for approximately 7 to 8 minutes. Now that's in a fan forced oven. The sponges come out of the oven, and how to check when it's ready, do it very close to the 8 minutes, is when you press it, it should bounce back and it shouldn't leave an indent. I have a clean tea towel here. I'm going to sprinkle some sugar on top. And this just helps to stop the sponge sticking. I have just slightly dampened the tea towel. Not much though, just a little bit of moisture in there. So while the sponge is still hot, if you feel comfortable enough doing this, pick the sponge up and turn it over onto the tea towel. Pull back the baking paper. So do this as soon as it comes out of the oven. We're going to peel the baking paper back and you can see that steam there. There's two ways you can roll this. We're going to roll it up in the tea towel. You can also use baking paper. You can either roll it this way if you're wanting a smaller cake that is longer, or we can roll it this way. That's the way I'm going to roll it. So fold the tea towel in. And then just start rolling it as tight as you possibly can. Make sure you do this while it's still warm. And then we're going to leave it in the tea towel to cool down. If you're not wanting to do a roll, if you're wanting to just layer your cake and glaze it, you can also do that as well. So you can leave the sponge to cool flat and then cut 3 equal portions, and then we'll put the cream and berries in between and then glaze the finished product. While it's cooling down, we're going to complete the other elements for our cake. Now this whipped ganache recipe can be used with any Callebaut chocolate. With this particular one, I'm using it with the ruby chocolate, but it does work with the Callebaut gold, the Callebaut white W2 chocolate, and the Callebaut milk 823 chocolate as well. So I have 2 portions of cream. The cream I use always has 35% fat. So it's a cream that has a perfect amount of fat for whipping, which we're going to do once this cools down. Now place a smaller amount of cream into the saucepan. I have a small amount of liquid glucose here. If you don't have liquid glucose, you can simply leave this out of the recipe. What this is going to do is it's going to help to hold on to the moisture in the cream after we whip it and apply it to the cake, so it'll stay fresher for longer. I have just microwaved the glucose a little bit to make it easier to get out of the bowl. I'm going to boil the cream to ensure that it's warm enough to melt the ruby chocolate. Now that the cream has boiled, we're going to pour it over the Callebaut ruby chocolate. Now the ruby chocolate is a natural colour, which is fantastic. When we apply other ingredients to the ruby chocolate, it does lose some of that pink vibrancy, which is normal because it's natural. You have the option, if you want to, of adding a small amount of pink color if you're wanting to keep that vibrancy, or you can simply keep it as it is once we add the cream. I love the flavor of the ruby chocolate. It harmonizes in this recipe with the chocolate sponge perfectly. It has a light berry flavor with a touch of sour notes at the end, but you're going to love it. So we're going to add the first group of cream and glucose into the chocolate. I'm going to whisk the first lot of boiled cream in together with the ruby chocolate. The aroma of that is absolutely beautiful. You can see instantly we lose a little bit of that vibrant ruby color, but I think it still looks quite nice and it matches really well with the chocolate sponge. Now with this particular technique, we've melted the butter fat in the cream as well as melting the cocoa butter in the ruby chocolate. We haven't boiled all the cream, so we can have a shorter gap of reserving this in the fridge before we can whip it. Now we need to reserve this in the fridge for up to 6 hours once everything's added together, so both the butter fat in the cream and the cocoa butter in the ruby chocolate have the opportunity to re-solidify before whipping. We're now going to add the second group of cream. So we've kept this aside so the butter fat is not melted. It will soften a little bit, so it needs less time in the fridge before whipping. I'm going to whisk that together just until combined. Now when we've incorporated all the cream together with the ruby chocolate, you can see that the colour dissipates, and that's because it's a natural colour. If you're wanting to highlight the pink notes in the ruby chocolate, you can add some beetroot powder to add colour or a touch of pink colour. So I'm just going to add a couple of drops of pink colour in. In this sort of application, it's always easier to incorporate a water-based colour. So this is a gel-based colour. Just a little bit. You can always add more if you need it, but you can't take it out. So just a touch of pink to give it a nice blush colour. This now needs to go into the fridge for approximately 6 hours, but it can go in the fridge for a couple of days before whipping. Now when we've got a liquid that's hot, so whether it be a custard or a hot cream or a ganache, we always place plastic wrap on the surface so it comes into contact with the product. Because it's hot, it's going to evaporate water. To ensure that water doesn't evaporate, we put that plastic wrap on to keep the water contained. The other problem is the water can collect on the plastic. If you pull it tight across the top of the bowl, it can fill with bacteria and slightly shorten the shelf life of your cream. We're now going to place that in the fridge and take it out in 6 hours. Now for the glaze, I'm going to put a texture in there and of course a flavour. Now I'm using almonds, but you can also replace the almonds with another type of nut. I'm going to place some water in the saucepan first, or you can also use Callebaut crisp pearls and chop them up. Some sugar. We're going to bring that to a boil or heat it just until the sugar is dissolved. Now the sugar syrup has come to a boil and all the sugar is dissolved. I'm going to pour it over the slithered almonds. If you can only get whole almonds, just simply chop them up to a symmetrical size if you can before adding in the syrup. I have a tray here lined with baking paper. You need to preheat your oven for these almonds at 160 degrees Celsius before you place the tray inside. Now I'm going to scoop the almonds out without too much excess syrup. Now spread the almonds out so they're quite even on the tray. And I'm going to bake these in a fan-forced oven, as I said, at 160 degrees Celsius for approximately 15 to 20 minutes or until they're golden brown. But every 5 minutes I'm going to remove the tray from the oven and give them a little bit of a stir. And the almonds on the outside will tend to brown a little bit faster, so just push them into the middle and mix it up again so they don't go too dark. What happens is the sugar will coat the almonds as we evaporate the water in the oven, and it'll keep the nuts beautiful and crunchy. The caramelized almonds are out of the oven and they've cooled completely. For this glaze, I'm going to take these and finely chop them. It's important that they're not too coarse. If they're too coarse, they'll actually slide down the side of the cake and they won't actually hold in the chocolate. So this is the size that we're looking for when you chop it. Don't forget, I also said if you don't want to do the almonds, you can chop up some crisp pearls. Now I'm going to use a paper piping bag, or you can call it a paper piping cone, to pipe the decoration. You can use a Ziploc bag and just cut a small amount off, or you can use a disposable piping bag. With the paper piping bag, we just roll them to achieve a point at the end. And you can see here that I've got the tip and I hold that in my thumb while I wrap this one around. Now the mistake a lot of people make is they roll this around this way. What you've actually got to do is pull it back, and you can see there I've got 1, 2, 3 tips all together facing the same direction. So with my thumb inside, I hold the inside point, and with my finger outside, I pull the outside point down until the tip of the bag closes. To secure it, I make sure I've got all 3 points and I fold that in to create a piping cone. So while I've been talking, the chocolate has cooled a little bit because I know I do talk a lot. So I'm just going to apply a little bit of heat just on the low setting while stirring, just to gently warm this up again. Whenever you're reheating the chocolate, make sure you stir it vigorously each time. If you are a little bit nervous that you've overheated it, you can do another test. But once again, as you're waiting for that test, this might start to thicken and cool a little bit. So I'm going to scoop up some chocolate, put it into the bag, and only fill the paper piping cone 1/3 of the way. Now, when you've got the piping bag, we've got the seam here. Always fold so the seam is in the middle, and we fold away from the seam. If you fold it the other way, you'll find that after you cut the point off, this will start to move and change in size. We fold the top down, and that's how you hold it with your thumb on the end. We're going to cut a small amount off the tip. How thick you want your garnishes will determine how much you cut off the piping bag. I've got a strip of baking paper here to put the decorations on. Now this decoration is a really easy one. So we're just piping circles, and each circle just offset it so you're not piping on top of the one you already had. Now with your piping bag, as you need to, just fold the top down again as you go. Don't hold the bag from here because the chocolate will end up coming out of the end. Just keep pushing down. Squeeze one more in on the end there. And then I'm going to turn it around and do exactly the same thing on the other side. I'm going to leave these to sit at room temperature. If you want to create a little bit of movement in this decoration, you can actually slide it into a vase or a pipe to give them a little bit of movement. But for this particular cake, I actually like them flat. Leftover chocolate, I'm going to cut the end off, pipe it back into the bowl. I have a sheet of baking paper here. I just scrape the excess chocolate out onto the sheet. Now I'm going to spread that out a little bit. It's starting to thicken already. We let that set on the paper. As soon as it's set, chop it or break it into smaller pieces and wrap it up either back into the original Callebaut bag or seal it tightly in plastic wrap so it has minimal exposure to moisture in the atmosphere, and it is best stored in opaque packaging. So don't keep it in clear packaging. So if you wrap it in plastic wrap, you need to put it in another bag or container that doesn't allow light to get through. And then you can simply remelt it next time you're using ruby in a recipe. Now the chocolate has completely set, so you can just break it up into small pieces or chop it and place it in a bag. I have a ruby cream here that I did prepare yesterday. Take it straight from the fridge. Don't let it sit out and warm up at all. Now I'm using a mixer. You can also just use a handheld mixer, or you can even whisk this one by hand. Because we have the additional cocoa butter in there combined with the butter in the cream, this whips a lot faster than normal cream. I'm going to add in some vanilla bean paste. We're going to start whipping. As I mentioned, this whips really quickly, so don't step away from the mixer, and we're looking for it just to hold. So a piping consistency, we like to say. So if you were to scoop a spoon out and hold it up on its side, it's not going to slide off, it's just going to hold on the spoon. This is the consistency that we're looking for. So the whisk is a great example. When we dip it in, it holds up to a nice peak on the whisk. You don't want to whip it any more than this because it will actually separate. So the fat and water in the cream will separate. If you do go a little bit over, it will start to look grainy. Now I'm going to give you a little trick that you can do to bring it back together. You can add some chilled cream, so just some 35% fat fresh cream into the mixture, and then just gently fold it through, and that will bring it back. If you've taken it a little bit too far, I can't help you there, but if it's just started to go grainy, use that trick and it'll bring it back together and no one will ever know. Now for the reveal. Looks fantastic. So just gently unroll it. Now what I'm going to do is transfer this now onto a sheet of baking paper, which will make it easier to handle. And you can see that sugar ensures that it's not going to stick to the tea towel. So that little step is really important. You're going to take 3/4 of the cream at this stage and apply it to the surface of the sponge. We're going to retain 1/4 and place it back into the fridge. So we're ready to pipe on the finished glazed cake. Now, if you take this out and think, oh, it looks a little bit too soft, just give it a little whisk by hand to whip it up. So I'm going to place about that much cream on the sponge. The remainder I'm going to place into the fridge so it stays nice and cold and it's ready for piping. We're going to spread the cream out evenly. Don't put too much on the edge here. Leave about a centimetre gap, and we want it to be the same thickness the whole way through. Oh, that looks so good. I'm going to place 3 different berries on the roulade, but it's really up to you if you just want to use one, or you can do it without fruit at all. But I think the berry flavour matches the ruby chocolate perfectly. So the raspberries are okay to go in whole. Just press them down a little bit and scatter the berries so you've got an even distribution. Try to spread them out so no one's missing out. Now with the blackberries, which are a little bit bigger, I'm just going to cut them in half. The remainder of the berries, set them aside in the fridge because we're going to utilise them to garnish the roulade just before serving. For this next step, you will need a ruler. The trick to this is to roll it as tight as possible and to use a baking paper to create tension as you go. Don't worry if any cream comes out the side, that's actually quite good. So when we cut the edge off, we get a really nice clean finish. So roll it. Make sure that you've tucked it right in the centre. Don't push down because you're going to push all the berries out to the edge. You've actually got to lift it and roll it. Then we get to here. You can have a look at the side of the sneak peek. Make sure you've got it tight enough. Then we put the ruler here. Pull the bottom piece of baking paper and use the ruler on top to tighten it. I think this is one of the most satisfying steps. So you've got the paper underneath here, which you're going to hold on to, the paper on top, the ruler goes on top, but you're going to hold on to the paper underneath. Push the ruler in while pulling the paper underneath out. So push it, take the ruler out, and then we can roll it. Now that goes into the freezer. This is a finished product at this stage. If you want to stop here, you can simply place it in the fridge and cut the edges off, or you can keep it in the freezer until you're ready to serve it. But I'm going to take it one step further and put a beautiful ruby chocolate glaze over the outside. The roulade is completely frozen, so it's taken about 6 to 8 hours, but you can leave it for a few days in the freezer before glazing it. I'm going to unwrap it now. I have some hot water here and a serrated edge knife. And then we just trim a little bit off the ends, just enough so it's going to be nice and clean. You've got a little taste tester there as well now before you serve it. You're welcome. If this feels even slightly soft, you can put it back into the freezer at any stage. So you'll actually feel it. If you can actually flex the center, it may need a little bit more time in the freezer. If you notice when you cut it that you've got a gap or a hole, use some of the ruby cream that we've whipped up to pipe on top and use a palette knife just to fill in any gaps on the edges. This is an opportunity to get to practice your tempering skills once again. We're going to temper the ruby chocolate with the same method in the microwave till we've got 50% liquid, 50% chocolate. Remember to stir it in between each addition of heat. Now it's time to vigorously stir. Remember, if you need some additional heat, at this stage you would use a hairdryer or a heat gun, but just a little bit of heat, stirring it after a few seconds of heating. Now don't take your glaze to the next stage by adding the nuts and the oil until your roulade is frozen and neatly trimmed, ready to glaze. Remember, if you need to reheat this mixture at all, and you will have some left over which you can reuse, you're going to reheat it between 28.5 and 29.5 degrees Celsius. I'm going to add in the almonds. Oil. Now I like to use an oil that doesn't have a lot of flavor, but if you wanted to, you could use something like a hazelnut oil. The oil I'm using is a grapeseed oil, so it's quite mild, but it can be substituted really with any oil. The reason I'm adding the oil, so when we glaze the cake, the chocolate is not going to contract and crack. So it will set, but it will set without contracting. For me, this is a great application of the ruby chocolate. Not only do we get that beautiful flavor coming through, but we retain the beautiful natural ruby color. Mix it all together. I like to have everything ready and set up before I put the glaze together. It's much easier to reheat the ruby chocolate without the other ingredients in there. Now that the other ingredients are in there, when you reheat it, it's very hard to work on consistency. So it is better to use the thermometer and go by the temperature or do a test. Now keep in mind when you're working with the glaze, you are always going to have excess glaze because we need quite a bit to ensure that we cover the whole area, but you can reuse the glaze. We simply scrape it up, set it, chop it up, then remelt it for the next application. Now this is the exciting part where we do the glaze. Make sure that the cake at this stage is frozen so the glaze sets straight away. Now let me know if I miss any bits at the front there. Now give that a bit of a tap. Now the nuts aren't cut small enough, they will just simply run off and not hold on the cake. So make sure you cut them really nice and small. Once it's set, which you can see it starts to go dull, we can transfer it to our serving plate. If you think your coating is too thin, you can recoat it, only if it's too thin. If you recoat it and you've got a thick coating in your first layer, it'll be quite a lot of chocolate to cut through. It's quite easy when it's still frozen. Transfer it to the plate. I'm using a star nozzle to pipe the remaining ruby cream on top. Now if you haven't got a piping bag and a nozzle, you can get a warm spoon and just do some nice little scoops with a teaspoon, just on different angles on top, and then you can garnish that. So roll the top of the bag down. Have a look at the cream. If it needs a little bit of whipping up, just whip it up by hand. Scoop the cream and place it into the bag. Now the hand that is underneath there I use to scrape off the spoon. Always push the cream down to the tip. If you feel any air bubbles, try to release them out of this end. Twist the bag. I twist it clockwise, but most of the people I've worked with twist it anti-clockwise, so it's totally up to you. I'm just going to pipe in a V pattern, but we start here. So start a little bit away from where you want the piping to end up. So we start here, push it backwards, and then bring it down and stop the pressure, pull it away. And then we offset a little bit. So the next one we start here. I know you're looking at me at this stage thinking, I'm just going to use that warm teaspoon and just do those little offset scoops. You can do that, absolutely. If you want to have a little practice run, try this on a plate that you can scrape up and reuse the cream. So we start here, push it back and bring it down. A little bit of leftover cream, you can save that for up to 4 days in the fridge. I would recommend only placing the cream on top and the decorations when you're ready to serve it. If you do put the chocolate coating in the fridge and bring it out, you may get a little bit of condensation, but you can simply pat that dry with some paper towel before piping on top. So these should just come off the baking paper because I'm sure you're going to have tempered your ruby chocolate perfectly. And I'm just going to place those on. Of course, I'm picking my best ones. So I'm just offsetting those as well, but really you can do any decoration at all. Now I'm going to place some berries on top. I'd like to say that we just scatter them and they fall beautifully, but no, I individually place them on, which is going to ensure that they're secured on the cream. Then I can have a look at the positioning. For me, this is the best part of doing cakes, pastry and chocolate work, is the finishing and decoration. Now in Australia, we can get berries all year round and they're a really good quality all year round. In a lot of countries, berries are seasonal. So if they are seasonal, use frozen berries on the inside. And for the decoration, just do more chocolate decorations and you don't have to worry about the fresh berries on top. I'm going to finish with a touch of icing sugar. I think this cake is quite simple and easy to make once you break it down. If you don't want to put the chocolate coating on, you can stop at the sponge layer and just simply decorate that and it'll still be fantastic. You can also interchange the ruby chocolate with a white, milk or gold chocolate without any changes to the quantities of chocolate that you're adding. Now, once you've created this, it can last in the fridge for up to 3 days, or unglazed, you can keep it in the freezer for up to 4 weeks. I hope I've given you a little bit of an insight into the Callebaut ruby chocolate. It's so versatile, the flavor is delicious, and it has a natural, beautiful ruby hue. I look forward to seeing your creations with Callebaut ruby chocolate.